Welcome everyone to the second to last of the LCT Centre online roundtables for 2020. Today we have Lee Rusznyak, and then in 2 weeks' time, so the November the 19th, at the same time, we have Jack Walton. I don't introduce, I'll let people do that for themselves as usual. And I'll just remind everybody that they can just unmute yourself and jump in and ask a question whenever they want. You know, you can put it in chat if you like, if you're feeling a bit shy, but otherwise just jump in, and that's what it's for. So we're trying to encourage that more roundtable-y aspect of this so that we don't end up with just questions and end. It's always been a case that the roundtable has been something which people can discuss things and engage with each other, not just with the presenter or the person who's leading it. So that, for example, if I jump in with something, then maybe, I don't know, I'll just pick a name out, Erica just jumps in and wants to take issue or to elaborate or whatever it might be on something I've said. That's something we always encourage. So just jump in. The point of it is to get your brain going. And since that is so rare, the spaces for it have become so difficult to find in the modern university that this is supposed to be one of them. So just jump in and join in whenever you feel like. You can do it on chat or directly in. And Lee will be able to just respond, or she might say, I'm just about to talk about that. It doesn't really matter. And you can also talk to each other as well. So I'll just hand it over to Lee, and I'll say that Lee, you're going to, even though people can jump in at any time, I hope you're also going to leave some time at the end, because people do have a tendency to wait till there. Yeah?
Yes, indeed.
You're nodding. Right, okay, I can't really see that very well. So speak. Yes, that's good.
Yes,
excellent.
Yes, that's
so
good.
there'll be time, hopefully plenty of time inside at the end for discussion. Excellent. Right, I'm going to hand it over to you, Lee.
Thanks, Carl. I just put my timer on. Great. Thank you so much. So it's a real joy for me to be here. What I'm going to be talking today is about how one develops student gazes and prepares them for practice, and what happens when it goes wrong, and something that we've done in South Africa to see if we can do this a little bit more intentionally, a little bit better. So yeah, I'm going to get right in with it. So the talk today is going to have 3 parts. I'm going to talk very briefly about knowledge and knowers in teacher preparation, which has some aspects of a vocational training and some aspects of a professional preparation program. So, you know, there might be issues here that are relevant to your fields too, and the kind of interactions that should develop their gazes in the field, but sometimes are not. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look at how, when a crisis happened, how we put LCT to work to make sure that those interactions are intentional, are there, and are done quite deliberately. And in the third part, I'm going to talk about LCT and research. So now we've done this whole big intervention, and it's left us with masses of data, and what we're going to then do with that data going forward. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that I'm going to have one slide which lists a whole lot of interactions, and that slide is particularly numbered in a particular way, and I'm going to keep referring to those numbers. So when numbers go out of sync at some point, those numbers are from that interaction slide that kind of is going to weave a thread through the presentation. So in 4 years, teacher educators have got a big job to do. We take students who've just come out of school into teacher training and education programs through a series of lectures, tutorials, practical experiences, assignments, and so on. And occasional times in school as well, intermittently, they are somehow transformed from a student at school into a teacher who can go back into schools and teach. And so there's a lot to do in those 4 years in terms of bodies of knowledge that they need to acquire, skills that they need to develop, dispositions, ways of thinking. And it's a mammoth undertaking, because you basically come in having picked up all the bad habits as well as the good habits of teachers who you've seen over the years. And in an education system that is not working optimally, like in South Africa, there's a lot of hope in the new teachers for transformation of that system into a higher quality, more inclusive system. What I just wanted to just point to at this point is, some very influential players in the field of teacher education, and how they're all saying that teaching is not just a matter of putting students in a classroom and letting them figure it out for themselves. There's a practice which has a knowledge base, and what I've just highlighted in blue here is the importance of reasoning soundly, making choices, thinking wisely, and where the decisions are not just about a whimsical, what feels right, but that there's actually a sense of what you're doing, why you're doing. And that's part of what teacher education ideally is supposed to give to the student teachers. And because I'm looking at students as knowers, I'm going to be putting all of the LCT work in this talk in reference to the specialization dimension. We could have used other dimensions to talk about aspects of the study. I'm not going to do that. We're going to focus on specialization, where the question really at the bottom is, what is valued? What is valued as the basis for achievement in this program, in this course, in this lesson, in this subject, in this institution? That's what the kind of questions that the specialization dimension allow us to ask. And like all LCT dimensions, there are 2 relations. And it's based on the principles that knowing is always about something, and the knowing is done by someone, and thereby setting up an epistemic relation to an object of study to which the practice or the knowledge is directed, and a social relation to this, which is to the knower or the subject or the person who is doing the knowing. As always, these are on a continuum of strengths, from weaker to stronger, and looking at them in relation to one another sets up 4 analytically distinct codes, if you like. The knower code is the one that we're going to be working in most in that space during this talk, where principles, procedures are downplayed. They're there, but maybe they're contested or they're not emphasized enough. But the knower attributes is emphasized, and we've called this this talk about developing the knower gaze. So we're trying to say here that the knower will have a special way of thinking, a special way of recognizing what counts as valuable, and that's what I'm trying to work on through this talk. We'll also talk at times about the knowledge code, where both the epistemic relations and the epistemic relations are strong, but the knower attributes matter less. It doesn't mean that they don't matter, but they matter less as the basis for achievement. And the relativist code, where both your knower attributes and your principles are downplayed. So some of the main ideas that I've drawn from knowledge and knowers, knowledge building and other LCT papers are that practices are socially constructed activities that are regulated by logics, that a practice doesn't just happen by itself. People just don't invent practices by sitting in isolation from themselves. And the practice has a history, a long history of how it's developed. And learning a practice isn't just you going in and figuring it out for yourself and doing it as you like. It's shaped by its history, it's shaped by what matters, it's shaped by codes. And through a practice, through learning a practice, one starts to acquire a gaze. And that gaze is what counts as legitimate, what counts as authentic, what really matters. And an example that I'm just going to give to illustrate is that student teachers, for example, think that if they can just get to control the class, then the teaching just kind of happens. And when they are struggling with classroom management, instead of becoming stricter and stricter and more in control, framing stronger and stronger, experienced teacher educators will tell them to work on their planning and their content knowledge, because if you don't have enough to keep the children busy that's interesting and worth learning, that's when the classroom management problems come. And it takes a gaze in terms of what really counts, and what you think counts maybe might not be counting quite as much as what you think. And that the legitimate ways of acquiring this gaze, this way of knowing and thinking, are shaped by interactions. And that comes from the 4K model, where you've got interactional relations in the social plane. And those interactions happen with significant others, which could be anything: artifacts, documents, experienced practitioners, and so on. But to get a gaze through apprenticeship takes many years. So another way of acquiring a gaze could be through conceptual means, and we're going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. I'm just going to introduce the social plane here from the 4K model, chapter 9 of Knowledge and Knowers. And really what this is talking about is the kinds of gazes that one can acquire through programs, courses, curriculum that have the knowledge code, but especially the knower code. You've got a curriculum that is legitimized by a knower code, and then what kind of knower does it give rise to, and how do those knowers learn that gaze? So we're going to take a position in this that anybody can learn to teach, given the right training. And so the weaker subjective relations is that the practice is open to those who wish to learn it. So I'm working with the bottom part of the social plane in this talk. The interactional relations is what kind of interactions do you need in order to acquire the gaze. So a stronger interactional relation would mean very particular kinds of interactions with the right kind of object or other will help you to acquire that way of being or that way of thinking. And a trained gaze is what matters most is the knowledge, access to specialist knowledge and procedures enables a recognition of what really matters in that situation. A blank gaze is a non-specialist gaze that does not need a particular knowledge base nor a way of thinking. And our challenge as teacher educators and all of us who are involved in any kind of vocational or professional preparation programs is to take students in with a blank gaze and over a very short period of time to not only give them the knowledge and the skills that they need to shape their dispositions, but also to train and cultivate the gaze that they need in order for practice. So this is the big slide that I said is going to take us right through the talk. And so what kind of interactions could potentially develop students' gaze as future teachers? And I'm looking at two aspects here. The one is the concepts from coursework, and then the second one is the learning and practice. And the majority of this presentation is going to be about shaping students' gaze as they learn in practice. So the field work component of teacher education that is required by all student teachers around the world in order to qualify as a professional teacher. So in terms of the learning for practice, I'm going to be looking at three particular types of interactions or objects that students could interact with. The one is examples of practice. And those could be watching their own teachers, observing and analyzing lessons when they go into the fields. It could be analyzing artifacts of practice like textbook extracts, worksheets, assessment tasks, and so on. But looking at examples of practice and kind of getting immersed into the idea of what lessons or textbooks should look like. I'm kind of drawing a little bit from Bourdieu's description of habitus here in terms of a structuring structure. And that is a guideline, a template, a requirement where students use the same format over and over again in different contexts, and it kind of starts to be a kind of a template in their mind to develop a way of thinking. You know, if you are having to fill out a lesson plan in different school contexts for different lessons, for different levels of learners, 20 times a week over a 4-year period, that kind of, the way it's set out and the logic of it starts to develop a way of thinking in your head about how you come to understand what is required for lesson planning, for example. And the same about reflection guidelines. The questions that we ask and that the students have to respond to every time they teach a lesson gives them some kind of signal about what is important, what matters. And the third interaction that I'm going to be looking about that kind of shapes the knower gaze is how others respond in terms of the feedback. In this case, the case of this presentation, the feedback on the lessons that they teach, as well as how their competence in the practice, which is in our case teaching, is assessed and measured. So we're going to come back to that a couple of times during the talk. So there's a lot to do, like I said, in teacher education. And, you know, basically there are two main spaces in which teacher education programs happen. One is in the lecture theatres and the other one is in the classrooms. Very different space, very different discourses that come there. But there's a lot that they need to learn. And what I've done here is just to give you a sense of a typical teacher education program will have different coursework. Some of it, what I've called their studies in education, their various names, would need to be learned by all students, regardless of what subject they're teaching, regardless of what level of the school system they're teaching in. And there's a lot. And as you can see, some of it draws on disciplinary roots like psychology, sociology, history, philosophy, and so on. Others is about the context, but there's a substantial body of very different kinds of knowledge that is required. You've got your subject knowledge of what you're teaching, the subject pedagogy, how you're teaching it, and those are going to be very much in terms of subject specific. So there's lots and lots of coursework that students have to master in order to learn to teach. That's becomes the body of formal knowledge. And then there's a lot that they learn when they go into the classroom as well. Some of it is embodied, like experiencing what it means to be a member of a school community, ethical conduct, and so on. The problem is, and this Hoban, for example, has spoken about that, is that in teacher education, the tendency is to look at all these different kinds of knowledges and put each one in a course so that it can develop conceptually and in a coherent way with increasing levels of abstraction and complexity. And what then happens is that those once the curriculum is designed, those courses are developed in isolation from one another, and the students are expected to make their own link. The boxes at the bottom are just to emphasize that here in South Africa, our legislation that governs teacher education actually labels a whole lot of boxes, and the knowledge is supposed to be put in those boxes. In fact, when we are doing our curriculum planning, we even have to fill in how many credits are in each of those boxes, as if they are easily separated from one another, and as if just having the label of the kind of knowledge gives the gaze and everything that students need. And then the magic just happens.
Lee, can I just ask something? How do people use this?
This is the paperwork that one needs to do, in other words, to get the curriculum accredited. So it's bizarre.
So are these mutually exclusive categories? So for example, is something fundamental learning or situated learning or situational learning or pedagogical learning or practical learning? Are they separate? It reminds me of TPAC and PCK and things like that, which just, you know.
and Schulman's, type categories of knowledge, where they're useful in terms of making sure that your bases are covered, but the messiness of real life and the messiness just gets in the way. But the magic happens because all these different kinds of knowledge that you've learned in all these different kinds of boxes are supposed to fuse together in the moment of practice. And that's the expectation of policy. Except they don't. And a survey that I did with some final year students, although some of them were able to see the links between the different courses that they did at the end of their 4 years, there were about a third of the students who actually said, I've got to the end of my final year and I still don't see how the parts are fitting together. So one of the problems is in terms of the examples of the lessons that they see, it's actually very difficult when you are a school learner sitting watching your teacher to see what the teacher is thinking and how the teacher is reasoning about what they're doing, why they're doing, when they're doing it this way and not that way. And all that you really get when you are watching teachers as a student in school is the outer routines of the practice. And one hopes that through theory and so on, that one starts to give the students, the fill in what is going on in the teacher's mind, how they're thinking. But the problem is that the courses that deal with student diversity are so strongly classified from those that deal with subject knowledge and pedagogy that the students are still learning everything in silos. So they're not getting that gaze made explicit, it's hidden. Let's look about lesson planning guidelines. The problem with lesson planning guidelines is that in many teaching education institutions, what the students need to do is list their steps without really looking at the rationale for what they're doing and why. And so you get this genuine example here where students write their lesson steps like this. I'm going to start off by asking what they already know, then I'm going to explain the work, then I'm going to hand out the notes, then they're going to do the work, and then we're going to go through the answers. And then you think to yourself, this seems to be like a generic recipe that could apply to any lesson, no matter the topic, and they're not going through the process of decision making about what they're doing and why. So when lesson guidelines is quite simply paperwork and not the embodiment of the choices you're making to set up a learning process, really you're wasting ink and paper. Because it's not helping to shape the gaze the way it could be. So what about this one here? When a lot of reflection guidelines ask, well, how did your lesson go and what made it successful, and what didn't turn out the way that you planned? What you're doing then is that you're focusing the attention right into the classroom and the practice, but not keeping an eye on the concepts from theory as well. So you're cutting off the opportunity for those concepts to shape the gaze, because you're focusing it on the here and now, on the experience. So I'm just going to give you a genuine example of a reflection that a final year student wrote in a journal that I analyzed last year. And, in terms of what's there, it's very descriptive, it's very concrete, So I've done a semantics analysis of this. And the only place that he's starting to think about the logics of practice is about the connection between managing a class and being confident in one's content knowledge. But aside from that, there's very little that is shaping the gaze about what really matters and what's probing, and how the concepts that you've learned in coursework are being enacted in the classroom, or how what your experiences in the classroom are bringing into question or extending what you're learning in the lecture theatre. The two are not talking to one another, and they being kept segregated. So another kind of interaction that one could hope for would be from experienced others. So the mentor teacher watches a lesson and then afterwards gives the student some kind of feedback about what they're doing right, what they're not doing well, and so on. And Borrello did a study, and here I'm going to just stop for a moment and invite contributions. Anybody just unmute and shout out. This is a genuine transcript between a student teacher, a trainee teacher, a teacher trainee, and the mentor teacher. In what ways is this enabling or not enabling a gaze in terms of what matters? So I'm going to just pause there and invite contributions.
Lee, it's Karen here from down south. I was going to say what struck me about this was when I was at UNISA, I had to evaluate our tutors all the time, and I hunted for rubrics that would, and that was the phase where the semantic wave had really taken shape in my head, and I hunted for rubrics that I could use that were meaningful, and because all of this stuff is the tips and tricks for teachers, but it's the stuff exactly as you said earlier on, where if you understand that classroom management issues are, that problems arise in that space because of the heart of the matter, the content, the knowledge and practices that you're trying to develop in that student teacher, then if you framed this kind of feedback as these are the kinds of things that help you to focus on what it is that you're there for, etc. And there are no rubrics that actually help you do that. You'll see so many, if you just Googled, teacher observation forms, you'll find that they ask themselves for certainly the left and the right. And that's just a comment. I have yet to see a really good rubric that would help.
Okay. We'll talk a little later. Thanks, Karen. Yes, and I'm going to go into some rubric issues in a minute. In terms of this, absolutely, just tricks for teachers, as you said. And so you think about, what did this student, in what way, what did they benefit from this interaction? Well, now I know that I mustn't write with a green marker, perhaps a relativist, no specialist knowledge, and really no particular ways of thinking. Maybe there's a little bit of more procedures here about when you start to say what you're going to do. Maybe that's useful. And then again, we're going back down to the relativist code again about no specialist knowledge, no specialist ways of thinking. Your handwriting's nice, was nice and big. And so it's they're not, and this is in a very, very flagship kind of mentorship program that this interaction took place. So they're not getting the kind of feedback from the mentors. I'm just going to pick up what Karen was just talking about in terms of rubrics. When you, Carol Bertram and I did a study several years ago, part of an international study, a national study into the initial teacher education research project, and many of the rubrics that teacher education institutions are using are of this quality. You know, you've got your criteria, and then the lecturer and the teachers have to judge whether something is poor, average, good, very good, and excellent, and then add up arithmetically the score as if the soundness of knowledge is just as important as, you know, whether you've written on the blackboard correctly. So it's a very reductionist way of assessing teaching, and it leaves the students really with this idea that teaching as a practice is completely relativist, because, oh, well, it just depends on who you get, because what's the difference between very good and excellent? If I'm good, how do I become very good? And there's no sense of what it takes. So the interactions that could shape the gaze, I've gone through a whole lot of them, but they aren't.
Lise, can I come in?
Please.
On rubrics. Yes, it's Ned Govender from South Africa. Yes, when I was teaching in class, supervising students, I was given by the university a rubric sheet, just one page. It had about 20 or 30 ticks that you have to make. But yet when I was at a college of education, I was given a very thick blank book to write copious notes in classroom. And they sometimes ended up on 4 or 5 pages of deep conceptual knowledge to support the students. So sometimes I think this is where the problem lies, because everything is mechanized now at university. Everything is just, you know, quantitative rather than qualitative. For me, that's where the problem also lies. Thank you.
I think that's a really, really important point. Thanks, Nat. I know that there's some institutions that they require the observation, the detailed comments to be written out, and then at the end it's condensed into this particular number, where the entire practice then becomes condensed, and it's just a tick box. But what those ticks are not giving the student the message about what matters. So we've looked at concepts from coursework, but we've seen that there's segmentation, and they're not seeing how what they're learning in coursework is informing what's happening in the schools. We're looking at what they're learning in practice, from watching their own teaching, but the routines and the care is visible, but the reasoning is not. And they come into teacher education convinced that they already know how to teach. All that they need is the paper. But they have the routines, but they don't have access to the thinking. In the South African context, we expect them to go into the schools and observe and analyze lessons to get lots of examples of practice. The problem is, and it's been researched, that when students go into the schools, that's when teachers become absent for extended periods of time, and the students are not getting the modeling. We're also having an education system that's in transition, and so you know, some of the prevalent practices that are in schools are very exclusionary, and we're actually trying to work against the grain in some ways. What about the structuring structure? Lesson planning is a great opportunity for students to really think through the decisions that they need to make in terms of selecting, sequencing knowledge, enacting it, how they're going to do this. But when it's just paperwork and meaningless, there's no point. The reflective guidelines could ask them to think about how the theory is, working in the classroom, how what's happening in the classroom extends what they're learning in the classrooms. But when it's descriptive, it's not having that kind of interaction that shapes the gaze. And the response from others, well, the mental feedback, when it's just classroom tips, it's not helping. And when the assessment is just about technical compliance, it's also not shaping the gaze the way it could. So what I'm trying to say here, lots and lots of problems about learning and practice and not getting the kind of interactions that we would want students to get through their practical teaching. So comes 2020 and plans are in place to put thousands of students in schools. Corona hits, schools closed down, and teacher education is plunged into crisis. What do we do? This is a problem that's too big for anyone to think about. And so I was part of a national collaboration project, which also included consultation and collaboration with the LCT Center for Knowledge Building to try and put our minds. We can't put them in the schools, so what can we do? And I just wanted to acknowledge here that the course that I'm going to talk about now is part of, it was funded by the Department of Education in South Africa and co-funded by the European Union, and it's part of a capacity development project in South Africa. So we designed a course, a whole lot of us from different universities, and in collaboration with the LCT Center for Knowledge Building. And this course was an emergence in response to this very complex context of students not being able to do practicals in their schools, but also gave us the opportunity to address all the problems that we are encountering with work-based learning. It resulted in an online practice-focused module. It was acknowledged by the government and the Professional Teachers Council and was deemed to be equivalent of 4 weeks in a school-based placement. So it went live in August, and up to now, there are 24 participating universities across South Africa who have worked with the project team, and so far, 28,000 trainee teachers have worked through the module. And only the final year students have been needed to have been placed in schools for half of their practical time, because this made up the other. So yes, LCT was pivotal to our thinking about the course, planning the course, and what I've done in red there, and where you can see this, the asterisks, those are all the places where LCT is implicitly or explicitly included as part of the learning that they do in this module called Teacher Choices in Action. And the logo is really important because we have the teacher working with knowledge, the teacher working with learners, so that the learners can work with knowledge directly. And different parts of the course then look at different kinds of relationships. So the teacher choices that work with knowledge, Unit 3, in which we use semantic waves for sequencing of knowledge, for example, would be highlighting the relationship between the teacher and the book, which is the representation for knowledge. So as they go through the courses, through the 6 modules, we look at different interactions in this relationship between teacher, between the students, and between the knowledge. And what we're trying to do is that invisible bubble of, the pedagogical reasoning that students do not see when they watch their own teaching. We're trying to make that visible. We're trying to make it very explicit to them and saying, we're in a classroom context, you've got competing priorities all the time, things like curriculum coverage versus the depth of student understanding, and so on and so on. And what really counts, what matters less, and what are the choices that every teacher has to make in every lesson that they teach? How do they weigh up the options? What are the decisions made by real teachers in diverse contexts so they get a sense of the logic of practice? What choices are appropriate when? And you'll see this little diagram that comes frequently up. How is who you are, what you teach, who you teach, where you teach, how does that come together to inform how you want to teach this content in this context to these students in front of you? And so it's really to try and make the decision-making process explicit. So not only do we tell the students about Noah gazes for them as teachers and how they are going to think and reason and make decisions, but we also give them the idea of gazes as a tool to think about what they're doing in their subject. So LCT didn't just kind of help us conceptualize the course, but it also gave us some of what we're going to teach in the course. So this is just an extract, for example, for Unit 4 about teacher choices that promote cumulative learning, where we say to them, it's not just about teaching your subject and connecting ideas and letting them understand the important specialized methodologies. But how do you, when you're teaching your subject, give messages all the time about what matters in achieving in that subject? So that is something that we do quite explicitly in the course. And we're talking, about especially the feedback that they give to the children when they do learning tasks in their lessons. When they give the messages, for example, about, well, you're going to go and observe this, it's a science lesson, make sure that you measure carefully and that you record your observations and so on. That tells a message about what matters in science. When you are setting out your mathematics and you've got to do it systematically, it tells you a method about what matters in mathematics and shaping the Noah gaze of the children that they're teaching as future historians, mathematicians, scientists, and so on. So this gave us a chance to put that on the table. We used semantic waves to design the coursework so that every unit of the 6 introduced a concept, unpacked that concept, took the students through a guided analysis of how that concept was playing out in particular lessons, or in this case, a WhatsApp conversation between a teacher and a learner. They then had to go and find lessons in a lesson library that was relevant to their own level of the education system, their own subject, and they needed to see how that concept was enacted in relation to their own specialization. And we ended each unit by looking at the implications for their professional thinking as future teachers. So semantic waves gave us a way of framing and designing the coursework, but it also was explicitly taught to students as providing a logic of how to sequence their lesson steps. You'll remember we talked about seeing examples of practice. And one of the problems is when the segmentation of courses happen, you might see an example of a lesson or a textbook extract analyzed in your geography pedagogy course and a different one in your inclusive education course. But what we were able to do in this program is take the same teaching artifacts and use them in different ways. So the WhatsApp conversation between the teacher and the learner about expenditure, income, and profit that we got the students to analyze, we looked at it in terms of what do you do when there's a pandemic, school is closed, and the students don't have internet access. And so it became a choice in terms of modes of curriculum delivery. We also used it in terms of working with knowledge and how there had been a semantic wave set up in this WhatsApp conversation between the teacher and the student. So there they were looking at the same artifact in terms of what they teach, where they teach, and how it's taught. At various points, I've spoken to you already, there were lesson observation reports that they then not only go and see the recordings, lesson recordings in a wide range of contexts, but really thinking about for this teacher in this context with this topic, how is what they teach, who they teach, where they teach, how is it informing how they teach? Where they stop just seeing the teacher as kind of a routine, doing routines, but actually a central part of the decision making that leads the lesson to be what it is. And to make that thinking explicit to them. The assessment rubric, instead of just, very good, good, and so on, we gave them a sense of what does it mean if your answer is not achieved or basic achieved or comprehensive. And what counts is using your theoretical insights and how that is working to inform your description. So, we worked with rubrics that did a lot more than were just a tick list. It gave them the criteria of what matters. So our intention was to make the rule of the game visible to the novice. Did we do that? We've got thousands upon thousands of course evaluations, and this is a sample. So I'm going to stop here again, and I'm just going to ask, read some of them, and again, unmute and just shout out whether the students felt that they had, through this course, somehow acquired something more of a gaze than what they had previously. So I'm going to just invite you to, if you see something that's significant in terms of where their perception are that they've acquired a gaze, shout it out and tell me, Sasha Lee says this, or the gaze is that. How they experienced it. So I'm going to stop at that point and have a sip.
Hi, Lee. It's Jodie here. Hi.
Hi, Jodie.
I just couldn't help but noticing that there is literally metaphors of gazes, eyes, seeing, observing throughout all these comments here. You can see that they're like tacitly enacting a gaze in their very comments.
Can you give me an example?
It helped open my eyes, gave us a bigger picture, better than observing, see, watch, you know, all of that. It's just nice that it's threaded through there.
Lee, it's Carol. Hello.
Lee, can you hear us? Is Lee, yeah, I think Lee's frozen at the moment.
Oh, is Lee gone away? All right.
No, she's frozen at the moment.
Oh, frozen. Okay.
But carry on anyway, Carol.
Sorry, no, her screen has gone away now. I don't know if other people have lost it, but now I've lost the quotes from the students.
She's gone. There's a storm there at the moment, so, but carry on anyway.
No, I mean,
and say what you're going to say.
Really interesting, as Jody had said, that very much that sense of people using those words like observe, watch, I can see something different. It really seems that they've seen teaching for more than just the visible practices. And really seems that they've been able to make connections in ways that they weren't able to do before, which is really nice.
Yeah, it is interesting that some of this feedback seems to be, I mean, often that referral to parts of the body can be, it's not always, but can be an indicator of a kind of knowery sort of gaze type thing. You know, people talk about having an ear for music and an eye for art and so on. So it is interesting, as Jody said, that at least in that couple of examples that Lee was giving us. Lee, welcome back. We were just, Carol was talking about, I'll let Carol say, you're muted, Lee. You want to unmute yourself? There you go. Carol, do you want to say that again?
Lee, sorry, when you went away, then we lost the quotes from the screen.
Sorry about that. Okay.
But I mean, it just really did seem that all of them were kind of saying how the course had helped them to see things, see connections that they hadn't seen before, and make those kinds of, you know, certainly that sense of seeing teaching as something more than they had understood it as a practice before. So it's going to be really fascinating to look at all of the responses from all different universities. I think that data is really going to be very interesting.
Indeed. Can I just check? Thanks, Carol. That's exactly right. And thanks, Jody. I caught half of your comments, but yes, opening my eyes and you know, helping me see the bigger picture and so on. So they got a sense that that their gaze has become more explicit. And I mean, that's what the whole idea of LCT is about, is taking something that is hidden, making it explicit, teaching it so that the novices can become inducted into the practice quicker and do things more intentionally all the time. Can I just check that you are seeing my screen?
Hi, Lee.
Yes.
Hi.
You need the screen shared, Lee. We're not seeing it.
You're not seeing it. Okay. Let me just try again.
There we go.
Oh gosh. All right. We're nearly done.
Hi, Lee. Can I just ask you something? It's Billy Mayer here.
Hi, Billy.
Hi. Hi. So actually, it was that slide that I wanted to ask you about. The previous one, the GT's lesson from the Reading to Learn video.
Oh, yes.
That's what some of the students were responding to.
Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just to move on to the third part of the talk, and this particular one, the Reading to Learn is a video, the one on peer pressure. Everybody from first year right up to final year watched that at the beginning, gave us some their lesson observation reports, and watched it at the end and gave it the lesson observation reports again. So that was one of the lessons that we made sure that everybody, all 28,000, watched this lesson twice. And that was part of our research design, which I'm going to talk about now. So there were lessons that we made compulsory. There were lessons that we did a guided analysis of those lessons. And then there were lessons where they could go into a lesson library and choose. I think we had about 150 lessons that were recorded, or online lessons loaded on for them to choose things that were relevant to their phase and their specialization. So we're going to now, Billy, what I'm going to do now is to show you one particular student. This is data hot off the press. It came through yesterday. In terms of a student, what did they say at the beginning of the course about this particular peer pressure lesson, and what did they say at the end of the course? And we will have a look then, because it's all very well for students to say, oh yes, it was so nice, we learned so much and whatever, but that's their perception. What does the empirical evidence say? And that's part of the research dimension of this project. So it wasn't just a COVID-19 intervention that is just for a one-year thing. This is actually, this course is going to be rolled out over the next couple of years as well. It's going to continue. Institutions that weren't part of our program this year are going to be participating next year. But we've been given a 3-year period to do this as a kind of a pilot, after which time it's going to be rolled out as a national platform. And once, and going to be part, should I say, at this stage, there's a strategic framework in place that the intention of the Department of Higher Education is to roll a national platform and to put this course on it as a resource for the whole sector for now and forevermore. But that's in the pipelines. For now, we've got a 3-year period to iron out any chinks, get rid of the glitches. It worked incredibly smoothly. I mean, it was quite astounding that in just 4 short months we could develop it, write it up, put it online, and get it operational. But why? Because we had the conceptual tools to be able to do this. And, there are people like Carol and myself who've been researching about this for many, many years. So we knew what the problems were, but just having an opportunity and the funding and the impetus to now actually make it happen was quite astounding. But okay, so the students think that they've got this gaze. What does the evidence say? I'm going to just go to the third part of the talk, and that is LCT in research. So the problem with researching practical teaching is that you have so many different students going into so many different contexts, and they all, having these very, very different interactions, and the learning is so uneven because sometimes they're getting brilliant mentorship, and as we've seen, sometimes they're really not. Sometimes they're being left on their own, and so it's uneven. And here we have this systematic research project taken by thousands of students. They're all looking at the same lessons doing the same tasks, but they're bringing in different gazes at different points of their teacher preparation program. So, your first year student would be bringing in a quite different knowledge base and gaze compared to a final year student, for example. And this sets up the questions and gives us the ways of thinking about how do students develop expertise in practice, in their practical learning? And is there value in learning from practice component of fieldwork? So the students seem to think that there was, but what does the evidence say? And the conceptual and analytic tools provided by LCT have been designed in the research project. Specializations dimensions, semantics, autonomy dimensions, all of these, Noah gazes, constellations, are all the ways that we're going to be analyzing the data. The students have been working on this for a month. So I'm going to just show you one task with one student and give you a taste of the data. All right, so this is a first year student. On the left-hand side of your screen is their peer pressure lesson observation before the course, right at the beginning of the course. And on the right-hand side of the screen is the same student, what they said about the peer pressure lesson at the end. So they haven't had a single day of coursework, university-based coursework, and this time they've just worked through the modules. So, we could analyze this with semantics, we could do all kinds of things. All I want you to look at is the social relations, the relation between how they're observing the teacher and practice. What are they noticing the teacher do? Are they noticing the teacher's thinking and intentions? And how is that coming out in the response? How is it different over time? And that's, another thing that LCT really enables us to do, is to look at change over time. And so here's 2 points in time, same student, same lesson. What did they see at the end that they weren't seeing at the beginning? So again, I'm going to just stop and just shout out if you notice something, call it, and let's have a look.
Hi, Lee, it's Billy Mayer again.
Go ahead, Billy.
Hi. Yeah, no, I find this really fascinating. I mean, I watched this lesson myself quite a number of times. And so it's quite actually interesting to see the way the student has learned and brought all sorts of LCT concepts and thinking into the second observation. So clear.
Billy, what do you notice? Which concepts do you notice that the student has brought in that they didn't have beforehand?
Well, talked about communicative learning, support for learning. It was particularly cumulative learning that I learned, that I noticed. Connecting to the main idea, learners could transfer knowledge to other situations. And
so they haven't actually named semantic waves, but the semantic waves is alluded to there, but they haven't actually specifically said it, but it's there implicitly. Okay, so that's going to be very interesting when we talk about, when we do semantics analysis of the semantic density, how the semantic density shifts from the first lesson observation compared to the end. But yes, absolutely. There's definitely more concepts. What else? Who's got something else that they've noticed?
It's Carol here. Oh, sorry.
Okay, Carol. Yeah, Carol, go ahead.
Shall I go first? You know, I was just thinking what is that the student is trying to understand the intention of the teacher by saying, for example, in the beginning, she tests prior knowledge by asking the learners. So she's saying, trying to understand why the teacher is doing particular things. Why does she correct the learners? Because they did not understand. Why does she read through the text? Because it provides support, etc. So I think that sense of really trying to unpack or try to describe the intention of the teacher is much more present in that second, in the second description.
Thank you. Okay, there's time for one more.
Lee?
Yeah.
Lee? Sorry.
Sorry, can I?
All right, let's go. Nick, is that I can't see who it is. Is it Martine?
It's me.
It's Martina.
Okay. All right,
Martina.
let's go Nick and then Martina.
Yeah.
Very quick one, Lee. What struck me here is the first response is almost like a visible descriptive framework, where in the second response, that's almost that same framework gets elaborated. And again, struck me the whole thing of knowledge building. So he's almost taking the first framework, which is probably forgotten by that stage, and actually building onto it and filling the gaps that were missed or were glanced over in the first attempt. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Martina.
All right. Thank you, Lee. My observation here is that in the last two sentences, there is a nice shift because on the left hand, the teacher checks on each group. So the feedback is focused on checking, controlling, while on the right-hand side, there is a focus of making use of feedback. And I think this is very important, observing what teachers do with the feedback, how they act upon it. So it's very nice way for noticing that or emphasizing how feedback is, what teachers, students do with feedback.
Yeah, so the feedback was a big part of Unit 4, which was teacher choices for cumulative learning that Carol developed and used Hattie's work there quite extensively. And we gave, the one thing that they learned was the difference between personal feedback to motivate, product feedback about what's right and what's wrong, and process feedback, which is about how they're doing it, so that was something that, again, yes, they've picked up from the course. So, all right, thank you so much. I'm just gonna move on. So, I've color coded the social, relations, and just a very, very simple translation device that, as I said, it only. The data only reached me yesterday, but I just thought, let me color code it and see what it looks like, just as a visual representation. So if you look at before the course, the teacher is very passive. The actions of the teacher are not even being noticed, let alone the intention. Whereas in the second one, the teacher is very much being portrayed as the decision maker, as Carol said, with the intention. And so there's definitely been a strengthening there of social relations, as evident in this one student out of the thousands, but we can see it very, very visually in that respect. So, that's what we're going to be looking at in the data. Obviously, it's early days in terms of the research component of this, but that's what we're going to be looking for in terms of answering the question, is it worthwhile to have a learning from practice component of the work-based learning field work that students do. Because so much of the learning in practice, they're not getting the right kind of interactional relations, interactions that are needed to shape that legitimate gaze. What else can we do? We can take a first year student and compare it with a final year student and see how the gaze has changed as the students move from basically the blank gaze in the first year of study to the more authentic, legitimate gaze, hopefully, as they leave. If a student in first year and in the fourth year, if there's no difference, then we've got to really ask tough questions about the value of teacher education. But if there's a significant difference, then they are acquiring the knowledge, they are acquiring the gaze. So this again is using the same thing. You will see that there's a lot of yellow, which was about thinking about the teacher intention, a lot more than came out in the first year student. And even the blue, where I've highlighted the blue there, which is the teacher is not being spoken about at all. What I haven't done there is considered the epistemic relations, because that's where those are stronger. So again, when we do a semantics analysis of this, we'll probably look for the extent to which the semantic density is changing. What is the semantic density of a first year's answer, and the semantic gravity for that matter as well, and compare that to fourth years, and what's happening in terms of their professional knowledge, thinking, reasoning, ability to abstract and use complex concepts to analyze and understand artifacts of practice as they move through their teacher education program. And so coming back to the interactions that shape student gazes, and what we've been able to do through the Teacher Choices in Action is to bring together ideas of how teachers work with knowledge and work with diverse learners so that the learners work with knowledge, and put that very much on the table and at the center of this study. There's a lot that we haven't done, but that's what we have done, and that's what we had a very, very particular focus, and that was our focus. We've been able to do lots of examples, both compulsory examples that everybody analyzes, as well as phase specialist examples, guided, as well as opportunities for them to look on their own. We've been able to give them lesson planning logics in terms of their lesson steps through semantic waves, the lesson observation reports to consider all the variables that teachers need to consider when making pedagogic decisions. And they've also had an opportunity for feedback and assessment. And so with that, my references, and we've got work to do. It's just beginning. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lee. That's really fascinating, and thank also for you built in the engagement as you went through. So, which is a nice way of sort of parceling it out, making it a bit more interactive. There's loads and loads of comments, and I haven't been able to keep up with them. People, just please unmute yourself and jump in. Martina, for example.
sorry, I did, sorry. This is the old raise hand symbol. But I'm very grateful for this for this presentation. Thank you, Lee.
You're welcome, Martina.
Janet, you've got your hand raised as well. Did you want to ask something?
Yeah, Lee, thank you very much. This is very exciting. I am also in teacher education, and I mentioned earlier on in the chat room that, yes, you know, all those concepts that you were talking about earlier on, and I mentioned that, you know, teaching has not improved and we're going backwards. But I think I've really struggled with how we're going to move forward with COVID, because I don't think it's just a one-off. I think next year we'll also be doing a lot more online teaching, and how we're going to prepare our teachers. We can prepare our teachers for content, but it's that professional practice, that professional behavior, classroom management. And I think what you've done is using your theories and your videos has brought it all together in such a wonderful package where it is integrated and teachers can use it. So I was wondering if I could get on board with you. I'd love to, you know, participate in your research in some way. Thank you.
Please contact me. Please contact me.
Sorry, Carl, I can't see a raised hand option on my screen for some reason. I don't know what it is. Lee, I wanted to ask you, what's the duration from a research perspective? This would be a fascinating longitudinal study on, as these youngsters, as the trainee teachers go into practice in the profession. If you've got any intention of tracking that, of following up?
That's a really interesting idea, Karen. So the one thing that is, this is a limit of the study, is that students are allowed to do this as a once-off somewhere in their training. So they can't, you know, we can't do it in their first year and again in their fourth year. So it's a once off. But what I am in consultation with is the South African Council for Educators, and the possibility of this being a kind of a foundational course and offering an advanced course which is properly theorized and has all the, you know, the real conceptual depth that is then developed as a top-up during possibly an induction program, so that they do the basic level, this level, during their teacher training, and the high level when they are qualified and going through professional induction. And then, in that sense, we wouldn't be looking at a library of lessons. The tasks would be very much directed to what they're doing in their classroom with their own learners. So, yeah, that's...
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Good luck.
Thank you.
Hi. Hello, it's Sarah.
Sarah, go ahead, and then Govinda's got.
I'm sorry. No, I'm happy to wait. I just don't know how to put my hand up.
Go ahead, Sarah.
All right, so very quick ethics, practical ethics question. How did you get hold of these samples before and after? Did they have to sign something?
Okay, so we got ethics clearance through my university because I was the project leader, and certain other universities like Carroll's University, for example, we had to go through ethics clearance of that university, but actually nearly everybody else in South Africa was happy that once it had been cleared by the WITS Ethics Clearance Committee, that they were then happy just to be informed.
Oh, Lee.
Lee, are you still there? Yeah.
Sorry, it's Carol here. Maybe I can just jump in because I know how students did this. So at the end of the course, which was an online course, all students who were willing to release the data, you know, signed a consent form online to say that they were willing for their assessment data and their reflections, etc., to be used for research purposes. So they signed a consent form at the end of the online course.
Sarah just wrote in chat, thanks, Carol. So Lee will be back very, very shortly. Just to finish off, I know Govinda's got the hand up, and there may be any other comments or questions that people have. Yeah, Lee, you're back. Carol answered. No, Carol answered Sarah's question. So Govinda.
Thank you, Lee, for the deep insights provided. I'm beginning to see this whole research and the course from a complexity theory perspective, because initially what happened was that the students were seeing things in silos. All the different parts were put together and the connections were not being made. So with this LCT, it's actually forcing students now deliberately and intentionally to see how these connections are made. And what is the beauty of this is that now when they begin to write in the new gaze, one find that there's a kind of holistic perception now happening about teaching and teaching practice. So, and there's also a tracking process, and that's the beauty of this project, because you can actually track specifically what is going on and provide evidence for what is going on. So for me, I think it's quite encouraging, you know, for the future for teaching practice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that what I want to say there is that one of the key ideas that I think underpinned everything was this idea that when you have what Bernstein called a horizontal knowledge structure, which where courses are segmented and cumulative, you accumulate different courses, which is the nature of teacher education, then the coherence and the cumulative learning comes in hierarchical knowledge, knower structures. And that's what we tried to do here, is to really work with the idea of a, who is the ideal teacher as a knower, and what kind of gaze would they need if we wanted them to really have the kind of reasoning and knowledge base and bringing it together in that coherent way. So we could not, I've written many papers about, trying to look for conceptual coherence in teacher education curriculum. It doesn't exist. I've just come to that conclusion. We've got to just accept it's the horizontal knowledge structure, and it's going to always be a collection of courses. But the idea of the hierarchical knower structure gives us a way forward. And, that's out of Mayton's work, drawing on Bourdieu and Bernstein and bringing them together in that cumulative way.
Do we have anybody else before we wrap up? We are pretty much at our time now. There are loads and loads of comments in the chat. And I assume that you've been assailed by the thunderstorm that you're experiencing at the moment, Lee, is that right?
It's past now.
Yeah, lots and lots of really fabulously positive responses in the chat, and also Paz or Mauricio will be saving the chat and sending it to you, Lee, so that if there are questions that we've missed or anything you want to pick up, you can do so afterwards. So unless anybody's got something they want to say, I mean, just jump in if you have. No, okay, well then it's up to me to say thank you very much, Lee. People are extremely inspired by this project, and we cannot wait to see and hear more from it. So the more opportunities that you get to talk about this, I think the better, because I think people are going to be very, very interested in this for all its aspects: curriculum design, the pedagogy, and you know, as well as the research. It kind of shows LCT can be almost like a one-stop shop for all your educational needs. So you know, just park your car around the back and just, you know, you can stay here all day. Anyway, so thanks, Lee. That's really fabulous. And I hope to see everybody in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, everybody. It's a kind of like rather strange thing at the end of one of these Zoom sessions where you get some like virtual clapping. There you go. So I can see it coming up on the screen. Nowhere near the same as hearing it, but there you go. Anyway, you would have heard some thunderclaps, I'm sure.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed, you know, this whole working on this project, and just sharing it here is wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's going to be lots of opportunities to discuss it, and don't think that just because you've discussed it here that LCT people or audiences wouldn't be interested in hearing it again in a different way, whether you've got a little bit more or whatever it might be. It doesn't have to be all fundamentally, you know, new material, because people are going to be trying to digest this. I mean, it's a major project, and it does take people. I know that whenever I do a talk that's related to a previous talk I've done, you know, and I feel, oh, it's a bit repetitive, everybody has heard this already, but actually it takes time sometimes for people to really engage, and they've got to understand what you're doing on its own terms, and then they've got to understand how that might relate to their own area and the debates in their own area. So don't feel that that's it. Please do keep
I mean, I think
taking the opportunity.
that one could do an entire, you know, I could have just as easily, you know, used semantics, or just as easily used autonomy, or just as easily.
There's two more. There's at least two more talks just on that front. You've got semantic, you know, like semantic ways. You've got the autonomy tours that you taught. So there's a lot of things that, you know, are in there already. So I think there's lots of talks to come. You know, so but thanks everybody for being here, and I hope to see you all in 2 weeks. And thank you, Lee, very much. And we will be putting this on YouTube. Maurizio, can you save the chat?
Yes, the chat has been saved.
Excellent.
And we can
send that to Lee.
Yep, send it to Lee right away.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.